The term Grail watch is thrown around pretty often, and I think a lot of people don't use that term correctly. Today I want to talk about Grail watches. I want to talk about my Grail watches, and I also want to make a definition for Grail watch as I'm talking about it. But to give a couple of little rules around Grail watches for myself, the way I look at it is I can't afford this watch. It's something that is unattainable currently in my current status, in my current walk in life. I cannot afford to buy this watch. However, I aspire to. So maybe one day, if situations change, if my money changes in some way, I'll be able to afford one of these watches. Today I'm going to talk about a few watches, about 5 or 6 watches that right now are unattainable for me. However, they are my Grail watches. I'm going to start with one that I think is pretty amazing. The moment I saw this watch, I knew I wanted one in my collection. And I don't think that that'll ever happen. However, it is a SEIKO, and it's the SEIKO Spacewalk, a watch that was designed for use in space. It was actually used during a spacewalk, and it has a 5R movement inside. It is a Grand SEIKO movement, essentially a spring drive movement that is used in SEIKO cases. That is the 5R86. This is a watch that was worn in space. As I mentioned, it was designed to be worn in space, unlike other watches that were worn in space that were just sort of brought to space or used in space, but the design wasn't specifically made for use in space. This was. It's a really awesome bullhead chronograph. It has a power reserve and a GMT. Not sure why you need a GMT in space, but it does make sense. Maybe you do. I have no idea. I'm not an astronaut. And of course, it was made out of titanium. It was a really awesome watch when it came out. Very large, 46 millimeters or 48 millimeters, something enormous, but so limited. These were very, very rare. And I think when they first came out, they were around $20,000 or $30,000. Now they sell for like $70,000. You can't get your hands on one. And if you can, they're very expensive. This video is brought to you by Whatnot.com. Whatnot.com are a community marketplace for collectors like me and you. Whatnot uses a live stream format where you can actually buy and sell watches during a live stream. They have auction functionality, buy now functionality, and giveaway functionality. In fact, that's where I'll be doing most of my giveaways going forward to help avoid scammers. Not only that, I'll be selling all of my watches going forward on Whatnot because I really love the format. I love the community aspect of it. I get to talk to the people who want to buy my watches, and they get to talk to me about the watches themselves. There's no better way of buying and selling watches. So come and join me on Whatnot. Download the app using the link in the description down below and get $10 towards your first purchase. I'll see you in my next live stream. Anyway, next on my list is, of course, an MB&F. MB&F, one of my favorite watch brands of all time. So creative. I love almost every watch that they've come out with, but I have one specific watch that is on my watch list, and prices on these have climbed up so steeply over the last few years. Unfortunately, it's come to where it's basically out of my price range, and that is the HM5. It's a driver's watch inspired by the Casquette from GP. It's also inspired by the Amida Digitren, a really cheap watch that came out in the 1970s. It's a driver's watch, so the time actually faces you while you're driving. It's one of the only driver's watches that works well as a driver's watch. Many watches out there designed as a driver's watch, however, it doesn't work well because you have to either press a button or you have to look at the top of the watch or the side of the watch or something like that. This, you look directly at that crystal and you can see the time. It's powered by a SOWIN movement. So this is a GP movement, a Girard-Perregaux movement inside. So it's not an incredibly high-end movement. It is a high-end movement, but it's not a bespoke movement for this watch. However, these watches used to sell for around $25,000 used. They sold around $50,000 when new, and now they are selling around that $50,000 to $70,000 mark because MB&F in general has become very popular, and unfortunately, that's just the case. I was able to get a Mad 1 recently, which is sort of a driver's watch through them, the Mad 1 Red. So that has scratched the itch for the moment, but obviously I'm still going to want that HM5 someday in my collection. Next is a vintage watch. This is a mil-spec watch, and it's the 50 Fathoms. And the reason why I want a 50 Fathoms in my collection is because not only do I think they're extremely good looking, I want one with a no radiation dial. I think they are just cool. I think they look amazing, and they are cool. They're a mil-spec watch designed for the military, one of the first or the first real dive watch, purpose-built dive watch with a rotating bezel. Really, there are a few different versions of the 50 Fathoms that I would take, especially vintage versions. Many modern versions don't really do it for me because they are way too large. They're around 45 millimeters. They have very high polished cases. They didn't really do a good job with them when they reissued them. There are a few 40 millimeter cases that I would buy, vintage versions, but they get weird bezels, so I think I would go vintage with the 50 Fathoms. However, they're very expensive, and that's the problem. There are a couple of different versions, as I mentioned, that I would go for. Tourneck Grayville, beautiful watches, very limited, very expensive. Very few were made. They were sort of a rebranding of the 50 Fathoms here in the United States by Alan Tourneck, who bought some 50 Fathoms, rebranded them, and sold them as Tourneck Grayvilles here in the United States to the US Army. And then there are a few different versions with moisture indicators. Actually, some of those Tourneck Grayvilles had moisture indicators as well. I really like those watches, and they aren't small. They're like 40 millimeters anyway, somewhere in that range. I owned a vintage, or currently own a vintage Waltham. That's a Bathyscaphe 50 Fathoms, which I absolutely love, in 37 millimeters. So definitely a historic watch, something that I want to own in my collection in the future. But again, those are very expensive, in the $50,000 to $60,000 range. So not anytime soon. Now, two more watches here from one brand. That is Vacheron. I'm going to talk about the 222 that was recently announced. I would take a vintage 222 as well. I absolutely love the 222. It's what inspired the Overseas. And of course, you guys know I love the Overseas. So definitely on my list. That's a new watch that recently came out. It's a thin automatic. They made quartz versions back when they were in the 70s making these watches. I would even take one of those. All gold. They have a beautiful bracelet. They made stainless steel versions as well. I would take one of those as well. Prices have skyrocketed on the vintage versions, of course, especially since the announcement of the new re-release, unfortunately. Next on the Vacheron list is the Corey Richards Everest. They made a limited edition version of this watch just recently, and those are selling for around $74,000. It's in titanium. It gets a beautiful textured dial in blue. You're getting a beautiful titanium case, a beautiful strap that's made out of fabric. They also make a rubber strap that it comes on. Really awesome orange accents on this watch. One of my favorite Overseas of all time, and I love the Overseas. I think they make some pretty amazing watches in that lineup. And I own the World Timer, but I would trade probably every single one of my Vacherons for one Everest. I think they are that cool. I love them. But of course, I really don't have that opportunity because they're very hard to come by if you can find one for sale at all. Next on the list is URWERK. Now, I have one URWERK in mind. That is the UR105. They're kind of famous for making wandering hour watches, and I really love the wandering hour complication. I've owned this complication in other watches before, but it's really easy to make them look cheap. They make them look like they came from outer space, and that's one of the reasons why I absolutely love these watches. I think that they are really just something completely different. Much like MB&F, they aren't traditional watches. They're not something that is on your wrist for the sake of telling accurate time. It's more for the sake of telling beautiful time. When you're looking down at your wrist, you're going to smile because it's just something very interesting. You get like power reserves with these things. Sometimes they put moon phases. They're crazy watches, but this specific watch has a little like flip up case that looks amazing. It lets you see more of that wandering hour complication. Really just awesome, and has some texturing on there as well. I love it. It's one of my favorite watches of all time, and I definitely would love to own one. But again, very expensive watches in that $30,000 to $40,000 range. And right now, I have two kids. not in the cards for me, but I hope to own one in the future. Last on the list, I have two watches that have the same movement, and that is really the movement that I'm more concerned about than the watches themselves, but I really do like both of these watches. The first watch is the Singer Reimagined Track 1, and the second watch is the Moser Streamliner chronograph. Both of these are chronographs, but they don't look like chronographs because of the movement, and that is the Ingenieur powered chronograph that they use called the Agengraph. And I'm not sure if I'm saying all of these words correctly, but this is a very complicated chronograph that looks very complicated. When you flip over the watch, it's a large space that shows you all of the movement. They are automatics, and that's because they actually embed the micro rotor. They use a micro rotor on these chronographs in the movement itself. So when you flip over the watch, you can see everything that's going on. Really great idea. Beautiful central chronographs on these watches, and I really love them. The Moser gets a fume dial, it gets an integrated bracelet, so you guys know I love integrated bracelet watches, and this is really a very interesting sort of alien looking bracelet on here. A lot of people hate it. I love it. I think it looks really cool. The Singer, obviously Singer Reimagined. Singer started out refurbishing and really elevating Porsches, specifically the 964, one of my favorite Porsches of all time, air-cooled. Really, the 993 is probably my favorite Porsche of all time, which is probably a lot of people's favorite Porsches of all time. But they do a lot of work with 964s, and they are very expensive. They sell them for like $500,000 or something like that. Their watches aren't cheap. Neither of these watches are cheap that I just mentioned in that $50,000 range, but they get some pretty incredible movements, and they're good-looking watches. But tell me what you guys think down in the comments below. These are just some of the Grail watches. I have a very eclectic taste when it comes to collecting. I don't really stick to one genre. So you can see here we have dive watches, we have chronographs, we have weird watches. I love all different styles of watches, and there's a lot of other brands here that I didn't get to mention, like De Bethune, who make pretty awesome watches that are inspired by Star Trek. So I could think of another brand right off the top of my head just like that, because there are a lot of Grail watches out there that I have my eye on. But will I ever own them? I don't know. I hope to one day own some of these watches or one of these watches from the list. I would be very, very proud. Tell me what you guys think down in the comments below. What are your Grail watches? Tell me what your Grail watches are. I know these are some pie-in-the-sky sort of high-end watches that I have chosen here. I have other Grail watches that aren't so high-end, but like I said, when it comes to Grail watches in that definition, I try and bring it really elevated, something that I definitely cannot afford and may not be able to ever afford in my lifetime. So kind of that's my idea behind a Grail watch. Tell me what yours is. Tell me what your Grail watches are. What do you think a Grail watch is? Tell me down in the comments below. I want to hear from you guys. Please also don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit that bell icon. It is super helpful for the channel, and I very much appreciate it. Please follow me on Instagram. My Instagram is WatchChrisBlog, all one word. I have some links in the description. Those links are to Amazon. If you click those links and buy anything, it helps support the channel. It doesn't cost you anything extra. However, I very much appreciate it. Anyway, thank you for logging on. I'll catch you guys in the next video.